You've seen the pyramids of Egypt, the temples of Greece, and the cathedrals of Europe. But what if we told you that Africa held structures just as grand, some even greater, that you've never heard of? What if buried beneath time and silence are cities, palaces, and temples that once rivaled the wonders of the world, but have all but disappeared from memory? Love what you're watching, QR's on screen, scan it and join the community. Don't miss what's coming next. In the heart of African memory lies a mystery, one wrapped in silence, time and erosion. It is the story of structures that once stood as declarations of identity, faith, empire and innovation. These were not just buildings, they were living monuments to vision, artistry and collective genius. From the towering mud mosques of Mali to the royal courtyards of Benin, from the sublime rock-hewn churches of Ethiopia to the haunting Nubian pyramids of Sudan, Africa once breathed architecture that rivaled, if not surpassed, the marvels of the ancient world. And yet today, these testaments of ingenuity are reduced to scattered ruins, buried in footnotes, whispered in oral histories, or missing entirely. What happened to Africa's architectural giants? Who built them, and why have they vanished from the global consciousness? To answer this, we must first see what was, before we mourn what is no longer. Africa is home to some of the oldest and most sophisticated built environments in human history, many older than their Western counterparts. Great Zimbabwe, for instance, was a city of stone raised without mortar, an engineering wonder that rose in southern Africa between the 11th and 15th centuries. Its walls, some reaching heights of over 11 metres, were not just structures, they were expressions of precision and harmony with the land. In Ethiopia, the city of Lalibela hosts churches carved directly into volcanic rock, created in the 12th century as a sacred answer to Jerusalem, meant to be eternal and hidden in plain sight. In Mali, the Jingareba Mosque in Timbuktu, built in 1327 from sun-dried mud brick, was both a spiritual beacon and a marvel of sustainable climate-adaptive architecture. Benin, too, stood proud. Its walls, massive earthworks that once stretched for thousands of kilometres, were the largest man-made structure on Earth before they were destroyed by British colonial forces in 1897. And in Sudan, the Nubian pyramids, elegant and sharply angled, outnumber those in Egypt, each a symbol of a deep and rich cosmology. So why don't these structures appear in the same breath as the Colosseum, the Parthenon, or the Great Wall of China? Why are they absent from the world's shared imagination? The answers lie at the intersection of power, colonial erasure, environmental fragility, and cultural transition. Colonial conquest across Africa was not merely about domination of land, it was about dominance of memory. Colonial powers understood something fundamental. If you erase a people's monuments, you erase their pride. If you remove their architecture, you sever their link to legacy. European soldiers razed African cities, looted royal compounds, and destroyed symbols of sovereignty. The burning of the Benin Royal Palace is more than a historical anecdote. It is a blueprint of cultural violence. Soldiers not only destroyed the palace but also carted away the famed Benin bronzes, masterpieces of metallurgy and royal history, scattering them across European museums where they still remain, locked in glass, divorced from context. But colonial damage wasn't just physical, it was ideological. Colonial planners redesigned African cities to suppress indigenous styles, replacing them with European aesthetics. Traditional African architecture was dismissed as primitive or unsuitable for modern governance. Urban centres like Lagos, Dakar and Nairobi became laboratories of imposed identity, with colonial buildings placed at the centre and indigenous forms pushed to the margins, literally and metaphorically. Even worse, colonial education reinforced this erasure by omitting or distorting African architectural contributions. Students were taught that civilization came to Africa from the outside, and in doing so, the myth of African architectural inferiority was born and passed down through generations. But even before and beyond colonization, African architecture faced unique challenges rooted in its relationship with the land. Unlike European civilizations that built with stone, marble or concrete, materials meant to defy time, many African societies built with earth, mud, timber and coral stone. These materials were not weaknesses, they were conscious choices, expressions of climate intelligence and cultural philosophy. Structures in the Sahel were designed to breathe. Buildings along the Swahili coast were tuned to the humidity of the ocean breeze. Many African societies didn't aim for permanent buildings in the Western sense. Instead, architecture was alive. It aged, it was rebuilt, it participated in the rhythm of life. It wasn't unusual to rebuild a home, a palace, or even a mosque every generation. Continuity was maintained not through stone, but through collective ritual. Rebuilding was a spiritual renewal, not a loss. But in a world that privileges the monumental and the immovable, this architectural philosophy was misunderstood. Over time, as kingdoms fell, as capitals shifted, and as rural populations migrated or urbanized, many grand structures were left behind, decayed or rebuilt over. Without written documentation, these wonders slipped into the realm of folklore, remembered by griots, sung by elders, but invisible to the modern eye. The legacy of African architecture, unlike in other civilizations, wasn't solely built in brick and mortar. It was encoded in stories, chants, songs, and rituals. In Yorubaland, stories of royal compounds and architectural innovations are preserved through talking drums and praise poetry. In Mali, the history of great empires is held in the minds and voices of griots who speak of ancient palaces, courtyards, and temples. But the modern world demands the tangible. Tourists want ruins, museums want artifacts, and so oral traditions, fluid, alive, and profound, are too often dismissed as ephemeral and unserious. African legacy then becomes doubly invisible, absent from ruins, and unheard in classrooms. We must also consider the spiritual and political transitions that reshape the built landscape. Many grand architectural centres were linked to dynasties, kingdoms, and religious traditions that eventually faded. In Ethiopia, the move from Zagwe to Solomonic rule created shifts in power and geography. In West Africa, the fall of empires like Mali, Songhai, and Oyo meant that old cities were abandoned or repurposed. The arrival of Islam and later Christianity reshaped aesthetics, symbolism, and even building techniques. As belief systems evolved, so did the sites of spiritual focus, often replacing or covering what came before. By the time European anthropologists and archaeologists arrived, what they found were ruins, misunderstood, misrepresented, and often reattributed. Some refused to believe that Africans built cities like Great Zimbabwe. Theories circulated crediting Arabs, Phoenicians, or even Atlantis. It wasn't until the late 20th century that African scholars began to reclaim authorship. But the damage had been done. Centuries of misinformation had embedded themselves into textbooks, travel brochures, and public consciousness. In the post-independence era, African cities grew quickly, but often in the image of their colonial inheritance. Glass towers rose over ancient courtyards. Indigenous techniques were dismissed as outdated. Today's Lagos, Nairobi, and Accra are more likely to flaunt Western-style architecture than reflect their own architectural traditions. Meanwhile, the world increasingly looks to indigenous methods: mud architecture, thermal airflow, community-centric design, for answers to the climate crisis. There's a painful irony in that reversal. While the West seeks to return to the sustainable wisdom of the past, Africa often races to emulate the very models that once dismissed its own. But the story doesn't have to end in loss. There is still time, there is still will, to reclaim what remains and reimagine what was. We can begin by reviving traditional building techniques, not as nostalgic artifacts, but as blueprints for modern living. Architects like Francis Kéré are already leading this revolution, using indigenous materials and methods to build modern schools, libraries, and public spaces that are both sustainable and distinctly African. We can document our ruins more aggressively through 3D scanning, drone footage, and virtual reconstructions. AI and VR offer the opportunity to walk through ancient Ife, to visit a digitally restored Timbuktu, to sit inside a reimagined Nubian pyramid and hear it whisper its truths. We must teach these stories, not just the fall of Rome or the pyramids of Giza, but the story of Kumbi Saleh's urban planning, the genius behind the Benin Walls, the mathematical elegance of Ife's courtyards. And beyond teaching, We must rebuild, not as replicas for tourists, but as living museums for us. Imagine a fully functioning Benin Palace, not just as a monument, but as a space of ritual, art, performance, and memory. What we have lost in stone, we have kept in spirit. But to reclaim our architectural legacy, we must stop treating history as burden and start using it as blueprint. Legacy isn't nostalgia, it is identity. Architecture is not just shelter, it is storytelling in space and time, and in every cracked wall, every buried stairway, every demolished palace, there is a line of poetry waiting to be spoken again. Scan the QR on screen to join the community. Also, like, subscribe, and tell us which structure to explore next.